Howdy, I'm Nolan Gray, Research Director for California YIMBY, where we're hard at work making California an affordable place to live, work, and raise a family. We just had our best year yet, legalizing mixed income residential and commercial areas, as well as removing onerous parking mandates, among many other reforms, and we're just getting started. Welcome to Abundance, a new podcast that I'll be launching to interview academics, researchers, and practitioners who inspire and inform our work. Since this is the inaugural episode, a few logistical items, if you'll allow. First, I'll be releasing episodes every other week. That might change. I might have more episodes, might have fewer episodes, depending on what you all think. And so do let me know there. I'll be posting video versions of this podcast on YouTube, as well as audio versions of this podcast on any podcasting app that you use. Second, before every conversation, I'll be letting folks know, hey, I'm going to be talking to this person. I'll be letting folks know over on Twitter. My Twitter is mnolangray. Do consider following me and keep an eye out for those tweets. I'd love to hear any questions that you have for future guests or topics that you'd like to make sure that I cover. And of course, feel free to recommend people who you think it would be great for me to talk to. Finally, feedback is welcome. I expect this will be an iterative project. I've tried to keep this early podcasting work cheap and easy to produce, so it's not taking too much time while still getting a lot of great content out there. But like I say, leave comments on the YouTube videos, fill out reviews on your favorite podcasting app. Oh, that's going to help me to build a better product. And if there's interest, of course, we keep this thing going and we talk to more and more folks. In this first episode, I chat with Donald Shoup. He probably needs no introduction to the type of delightfully weird person who's listening to a housing and land use podcast. But Shoup is a distinguished research professor at UCLA and the author of The High Cost of Free Parking, among many other works. He essentially invented this whole field of parking studies that has excited so many people. And I'm really excited to be talking to him, especially now after some of the really big victories that we had with parking reform in California. In this episode, we talk about some of the 2022 victories. We talk about the man behind the legend. And we talk about where we go from here. Of course, Shoup knows after a lifetime of advocating for parking reform, there's still a lot of work left to be done. With that, on to the show. So how are you feeling today? How are you feeling about, here we are, AB 2097 has passed. Parking requirements are, at least for the most part, dead within much of California, certainly within proximity to transit. Pretty big vindication for your career. How are you feeling?
Well, I'm alive. I think that's one good sign. I think that it's COVID has made life difficult for all of us, but it has illuminated a lot of bad things about parking and a lot of good things about the reforms that we've found, to which we thought were just to respond to the emergency of COVID, but now we find we want to keep doing it. We should have been doing it all along. So I think that on balance, COVID has had many higher costs than benefits, but there were some benefits, and I think maybe we should focus on those today.
You mean, for example, stuff like removing parking spaces or allowing restaurants to operate in parking lots?
Allowing things to happen. That you and I have had lunch at a parking lot recently because LA and many other cities have allowed restaurants to convert their required off-street parking into outdoor dining, which is exactly the opposite of what minimum parking requirements require. That we now have more dining space and less parking, right. And we like it better. So for 70 years, we've said if you want to have more dining, you have to have more parking spaces. And now we say you could have more parking and more dining and less parking. So I think we've learned a lot, that we've been doing a lot of things backwards. And I think that's an upside of what we've learned. And also that maybe the curb lane is more valuable for outdoor dining than for storing unused cars. So I think that certainly we've learned a lot about from restaurants, but I mean, the curb lane has many uses other than storing unused cars. It could be bike lanes. It could be bus lanes. It could be outdoor dining. There are a lot of things more valuable than storing unwanted cars.
Well, I mean, you're ascribing, I think, some of this to COVID, and certainly, I think there was a lot of rethinking of how we use parking during COVID. But I mean, to my mind, you had been laying the groundwork for a lot of this rethinking that's going on right now, right? You know, forcing people, right? It's in the title of your book, the high cost of free parking. I think that had been a much larger project that you'd been undertaking for decades, trying to get people to rethink the way we use land for parking.
Well, yes, I think that, for now, well, I don't know, 40 years, I've been saying that city planners have got it exactly the wrong way around when it comes to parking, is that we keep the curb lane for curb parking is mostly free. Everybody wants to park free, including you and me. But we shouldn't have let that become the central feature of how we build our cities and how we plan our cities. So I think that cities should charge fair market prices for curb parking rather than leave it for free. And the second thing I recommend to make that popular is to spend the meter revenue to pay for added public services on the metered blocks, so people will see the benefits of parking. They'll see clean sidewalks. They'll see healthy street trees. Some cities give free transit passes to everybody who lives or works on the block. So I think that these parking benefit districts will make charging for curb parking politically desirable, not a political suicide. And then I think the third policy I recommend is to remove off-street parking requirements. So cities are doing just the opposite of what I recommend, or I should say I recommend the opposite of what cities are doing.
Well, the opposite order, right? Reverse order.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That one of the simplest reforms would be to convert all minimum parking requirements into parking maximums, so that if the city thinks that that's enough parking spaces, that they have dozens of pages of parking requirements, say here's the minimum amount we require, and that's enough. Well, then you say, well, why not prevent more than enough? So I think that COVID has caused us to think not just about parking, but about streets altogether, because some cities have closed streets and made them for pedestrian uses. Like if you've been to Barcelona, everybody wants to go there. It's famous for streets that are for rambling. Yes, I think it's opened our eyes to how much noise and dirt come from cars, and especially the noise. I think getting rid of a lot of the noise has been a great benefit.
Yeah, I shouldn't tell you this, but last time we ate at the Apple Pan, I parked on the street and I didn't have enough change, so I just risked it and didn't fully cover the parking meter. Didn't get a ticket though. I think maybe they saw that I was hanging out with you, the parking attendant, and yeah, I got lucky there. Normally, I do happily pay for parking, to be clear.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I mean, this is an interesting question that a few people asked when I said that we were going to be having this conversation, was your view on parking maximums. So of course you've been highly critical of parking minimums. But now that those seem to be on the way out, what are your views on parking maximums? What do you think is the appropriate role of those?
Well, after reading your book, I think that I would be certainly recommend more to regulate the quality of parking rather than the quantity. Now we regulate the quantity, and we require so much parking that the developers want to provide it as cheaply as possible. And they don't spend much money on good urban design of parking lots, because there's just so much of parking, you can't make it look good. So I think that they should remove off-street parking requirements and regulate any of the offending aspects of curb parking. That what about the water runoff? What about the urban design aspects of it? What about the pedestrian accessibility? What about the curb cuts that are needed? Where should they go? What about, well, a lot of things about parking, how it looks. I think they should, if you don't like the looks of parking, the solution is not to limit the amount of parking. The solution is to regulate what it looks like. And some cities, they require landscaping, one tree for every 8 parking spaces or something like that, or landscaping around the perimeter, so to disguise some of it. Some cities require that all the ground floor uses on a parking structure has to be in active uses, like restaurants or stores. And some cities require wrapping the parking structure with active uses, like apartments or office buildings. They give the name of Texas donut to this solution, is that the parking is in the interior where nobody can see it. And the exterior all has windows. It looks like an apartment house. So I think rather than regulating the maximum number of parking spaces, it'd be better to regulate, to reduce the offensive byproducts of parking. But I think that politically, maybe the solution, the easiest solution, is to convert the minimums into maximums because they're so high to begin with. It's easy to explain. And I think since we've been requiring minimum parking amount of parking for 70 or 80 years, maybe we should admit that we have too much and that we could do with less. I remember once I was talking to a developer in Westwood when there was a proposal for maximum parking parking maximums. And they were surprisingly amenable to that. And one of them said, well, we don't mind being screwed if everybody is screwed to the same depth. That if all your competitors have parking maximums, then it's no problem for you. I mean, you're not put at a competitive disadvantage if you have what some people think you don't have enough parking. So I think that and the cities that do have maximums, I've never heard of them getting rid of them. And some cities have very easily switched from minimums to maximums. Say Nashville, Tennessee, a couple of weeks ago. That's what they did. They just converted the minimums into maximums without changing any of the numbers. That's what Mexico City did. So I think politically it's probably easier to do that, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we should also regulate the quality of the off-street parking. And that too will increase the cost of providing the parking. If you have to have landscaping instead of parking spaces, it will cause developers to, on their own, just to say, well, they're expensive and we don't need this many. And I think in Singapore, they have a very sensible thing. They don't call it a maximum, but they call it a standard. And they say that any number of parking spaces above the standard counts towards the floor area ratio of the building. And the developers think of that as a parking maximum because they realize that another extra parking space is not worth losing that amount of office space or apartments. You think?
Well, and Singapore too. I mean, they have like congestion pricing, and they have a whole bunch of policy mechanisms designed to sort of internalize the cost of cars, right?
Well, not so much about parking. Singapore is much better at regulating moving cars than about cars at rest. That they do have what they call these standards, and you could build parking up to that standard, and it doesn't cost you anything in terms of the amount of real uses that you have of the land.
Yeah. Who in the world do you think gets parking policy best? You mentioned Singapore as an example. Are there other examples from abroad that excite you?
Well, yes, I think Copenhagen, the usual suspects, and Amsterdam and Oslo, and but other cities are doing a good job. Sao Paulo. Most people think who've looked at it that Tokyo has the best parking policies. That they have a very low off-street parking requirements, and they don't allow on-street parking. With some exceptions. And at night, they absolutely prohibit on-street parking. And they have the famous requirement that if you want to buy a car, you have to prove that you own or have rented a parking space. But people in the past would rent a parking space, the next buy the car the next month, they would stop paying the rent and they would want to park on the street. But now when Tokyo ever tows your car away from the curb at night, you can't say, I didn't realize there was a prohibition on curb parking at night, because I have because the city has your certificate saying that you own off-street parking. So I think Tokyo has a much more pedestrian activity on their streets. They have a much less traffic. Well, yes, I think many experts would say Tokyo has the best parking policies.
Great. And so in a place like California, right, we've passed AB 2097, eliminating parking requirements within a half mile of transit. Let's just say we proceed, we can remove parking requirements everywhere. What's next for parking policy? On-street parking pricing, or
yeah. Well, I think in California, it'll take a while for this to have any effect. I think one of the first effects of removing off-street parking requirements near transit is that property owners will be able to reuse their property for better uses. Say if you have a shoe store that requires 2 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet, you want to convert it into a restaurant, the city will say, no, you don't have the required parking spaces, so you cannot reuse that building. So I think, I hope people have begun to realize that minimum parking requirements have a terrible effect in historic cities because it encourages developers to tear down older buildings to provide parking. Say there was a small town in Idaho, Sandpoint, Idaho, is one of the first I talked to, and they saw, it's only a population of about 9,000 people, but they saw that in downtown when a bank wanted to add to its existing building, it needed required parking, and they tore down a historic building to provide it. That's happened all over the country for decades. But in a small town, it became very clear that this had happened, and they got rid of the parking requirements. And I think you're familiar with Fayetteville, Arkansas, and they began to realize that they had a lot of underused or unused wonderful old buildings. And the planner at the desk began to realize that when people came to ask for a permission for reuse, he had to tell them, well, where is your parking? So he understood it as the parking requirement that was prohibiting the reuse of buildings he could walk past every day. And as soon as they began to talk about that, the city council understood it. And now a lot of these older buildings have been reused. So I think it's you can see it right in front of your eyes, especially in a small town, that minimum parking requirements make it very hard to reuse the buildings you want to save.
Right. I mean, those are good examples too, because I think folks often assume that this is a big city issue, right? That the parking requirements are maybe an issue for New York or Los Angeles, but they can have huge implications for even a small town. I mean, I saw you just tweeted about the other day, Anchorage, mid-sized city removing minimum parking requirements. Even there, it can, have these deleterious effects. Even in places where the maybe the requirements aren't binding on residential. It can block the reuse of historic commercial properties, right?
Yes, well, and it takes a long time. Anchorage is a funny example because when the high cost of free parking was published, the American Planning Association asked me to be part of not a podcast. It was sort of a online typed podcast that people would send in questions to me about these ideas of getting rid of parking requirements. There was a very, sort of I think he was more than an intern, but he was a very junior planner in Anchorage, wrote a very critical and very critical complaint about what I was saying and that this wouldn't work in Anchorage. And he got more personal than need be. So I responded with a CC to the head of city planning in Anchorage and told him why I thought Anchorage would be better off without minimum parking requirements. And they wrote back and said, we'll consider this. Well, that was in 2006, I think. And now, what is that? 16 years later, they got rid of the minimum parking requirements. So I'm used to the fact that things have taken much longer than I thought they would to happen, but now they're happening much faster than I thought they could. Because you know of Tony Jordan, who's head of the Parking Reform Network, which is a group of people who are advising cities and planners on some of these ideas about removing off-street parking requirements. And they have a map of cities in the U.S. that have removed all their parking requirements. And there are a lot of them. And he had said last week, last week, 3 cities have removed their parking requirements. Nashville, Cambridge, I forget what the other one was, but there are a number of small ones. I
believe late last month, my hometown, Lexington, Kentucky, completely eliminated minimum parking requirements.
Well, see, now that is what I thought would happen in maybe 2007.
Better late than never, right?
Well, I think any success I have is a combination of longevity and perseverance. So that I realized I've been saying the same thing over and over again, but I have to say it over and over again because nobody was listening. And now I think there's enough. The snowball is big enough and is rolling downhill fast enough that they don't need me so much anymore.
So to my knowledge, in terms of you as a messenger, to my knowledge, you're the only currently practicing planning professor where people call themselves some variation of their name, right? So there are Shoupistas. There are people who call themselves Shoupistas. They gather in Facebook groups and post. Why do you think that happened around you or this policy issue? It's a funny thing, isn't it? I mean, most professors don't have a movement like that grows around them.
Well, I think it was the topic. I think that the benefits of undoing these bad regulations we have are so enormous, and it's so easy to see them once it's been pointed out to you that I think any writer hopes to think that people will think, of course, that's true, but he'd never heard it before. You won't. That's my aim in writing, is to have everybody agree with me. But they've never even thought about the issue before.
You think people read your work and they have a eureka moment and they start seeing things maybe they haven't seen before?
I think so. I think these issues we've been talking about the harm done by our 3 major parking policies, it's easy to see once it's been pointed out to you, and it's easy to correct. Let's put it that way. It doesn't cost the city anything. It increases property taxes and reduces traffic congestion. There's all kinds of benefits. So I think usually when I talk to people or write about anything, I realize they're not interested in parking. Very, very few people are interested in parking itself. But they are very concerned about global warming or affordable housing or
Well,
air
I do have
pollution.
my parking matters hat. People, I
Yes,
think
well,
when most people see me wearing this, they assume I'm coming from like a parking garage management trade show or something. I don't think they know that I'm a shoepista, right?
yes. Well, I think that whatever your concern is, parking reforms will help you. So you're not interested in parking reforms because you think parking ought to be reformed. You're interested because you're worried about homeless people. You're worried about air pollution. You're worried about any number of things in urban planning. You're worried about how ugly the city looks.
Hmm.
You're worried about noise. You're worried about pedestrian deaths in traffic, or even the drivers themselves get killed. And our accident rates have been going up when the rest of the world have been going down. So I think I try to show how parking reforms affect just about everything in life. How could it not? Because parking is the single biggest land use in the whole country.
Hmm. Right. Well, and it's funny you share these stories pretty regularly in your seminar and over email of violent altercations that occur as a result of parking or the absurd things that people do to secure parking spaces. It seems it's easy to dismiss as this kind of uninteresting or unimportant thing, but it seems to be this really probably one of the main quality of life issues in cities is knowing where you're going to park and how much it's going to cost. And yeah.
Well, yes, I mean, because we keep most curb parking free and it's overcrowded, that people have to compete for it. They cruise around, drive around, hoping to see an open space. And sometimes there are conflicts about this. And I have a collection of newspaper headlines that there's something that I don't know whether the American Psychological Association has adopted it yet, but I call it the paid parking derangement syndrome. It's that when faced with the prospect of paying for parking, some people lose touch with all reality and they become they say things that they would never say otherwise. I think rational people quickly become emotional, and staunch conservatives become ardent communists when it comes to parking. I think, well, again, I'm sure the psychologists wouldn't agree with me, but I think thinking about parking occurs in the reptilian cortex, which was the earliest part of the brain that was developed to make snap decisions like how to avoid being eaten. And you don't think rationally about it. You just want a parking space. And it deals with territoriality and ritual display. So all these things are involved in parking. And I think they would all be taken out of parking if we charge the right price for curb parking, which is the lowest price the city can charge, and still have one or two open spaces on every block. So wherever you drove throughout the city, you'd see one or two open parking spaces, like in the Hollywood movie version of The Good Life in Manhattan. There's always an open parking space waiting for you as you arrive at your destination. And the most recent article I'm working on is the example of the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which is famous for parking problems. Seinfeld, of course, was cited there. There were 4 issues of Seinfeld dealing with parking. The one I liked best was when George and Elaine were driving to Jerry's apartment, and George kept driving around hunting for a curb parking space, and Elaine told him, well, let's park in the building. And he turned on her and said, paying for parking is like going to a prostitute. Why should I pay if, when I apply myself, maybe I could get it for free? Well, we're all trying to get it for free, just as you were at the Apple Pad. That will be willing to not pay for something we know we ought to pay for. Nobody thinks of overstaying at a parking meter as a crime. They think it's a victimless crime, but it does have victims, because if you take a parking space, somebody else can't. And that does lead to murders and
well, and that's I mean, that's a funny right, on the Apple Pen example, right? So I underpaid $1, $2, which seems unimportant, but I would never in a million years, walk out of a gas station with a chocolate bar or a bag of chips, right? It would be
That's
unthinkable. But
that's right.
overstaying at a parking meter is like, well, that's, come on, it's not hurting anyone, right?
Well, exactly. If you thought the enforcement is low, as it always is,
Hmm.
and there's very little chance that you'll be caught, most people will take a chance, especially if it's for a short time. But
Have you ever had?
but excuse me, but I think if
Sure.
you get the price of curb parking right and spend the revenue on the added public services, say on the Upper West Side, I estimated that it would generate about $1,000 a year per
Hmm.
household to charge for the curbs parking spaces, and there's only one curb space for every 20 people in the Upper West Side. So we started charging fair market prices for curb parking. 1 out of 20 would, if they were residents, would be paying, and 19 out of 20 would be getting clean and safe sidewalks. They'd be getting free transit passes. They would be getting healthy street trees. They would be getting a lot of added public services. So I think if we did that, then anybody who saw a a car that was parked without paying, they would think they're stealing from us.
Hmm. Right.
They're taking this is our money to pay for our public services. So I think there would be much more political support for more careful enforcement.
Right. Right. Well, and in the Upper West context too. I mean, when I lived in the Upper East Side, of course, there are very few parking spaces available, but every morning it would be commuters who would come in and cruise around and try to find a spot. So even, you say only 1 in 10 residents would even be paying. It might not even be residents. It might even be folks who are coming in and trying to park in the neighborhood.
Exactly. It's like Monty Python's solution to Britain's financial problem is to tax foreigners living abroad. And I think this is not even a tax, it's just charging users from outside that the curb parkers would be paying guests, not freeloaders. They're freeloaders now. And I think that who cares? I mean, would you object to somebody parking on the east side? And the money disappears into the general fund. It might as well be going to Mars. So I think that for the parking revenue needs the right recipient in order to generate the political support for the right policy.
Mm. Right. I wanted to raise another sort of related policy area that you've been talking about a lot recently, which is disabled parking placard abuse. What kind of needs to be done there to your mind?
Well, I think we'll have to do it in California because I think 13% of all drivers have a disabled parking placard. And in San Francisco and LA, where we have this dynamic pricing and the cities raise the price of parking on spots that are always crowded, it didn't have the effect that everybody thought it would have, at least always, because if you have a disabled parking placard, the price doesn't matter. If you
Mm.
raise the price, the
You don't
paying
you don't
costs
pay.
no, you don't
Yeah.
have to pay. It's a disabled parking placard in California is a permit to park anywhere, anytime for as long as you want
Mm.
at a meter. So I think that it's led to an immense amount of placard abuse, heavily documented on TV programs and in academic articles, that some blocks in downtown, every single space is occupied by a car with a disabled placard. So what's the point of raising the price or adjusting the price? So I think that California will have to pay more attention to disabled parking placards, and they can easily adopt the policies in Michigan and Illinois. Michigan had the same policy that California has. Any parking placard is a parking permit. And there was an immense amount of placard abuse. So they, in their new policy, they said we have two tiers of a parking placard. The one you have will stay the way it is, but there's a new higher tier that if you have serious mobility impairment, that you can't walk to a parking meter or you have a heart condition that prevents walking any distance, that you get the special tier, and that allows you to park free at parking meters and every place else that for parking placards are used. And in the first year, they very specifically laid it out where the doctor has to attest to one of these 4 conditions. And they sent a letter to everybody who had a disabled parking placard and only to ask them to apply for the upper tier if they could get a doctor to certify that they have impaired mobility. And only 3% of the placard holders applied for the upper tier. So immediately 97% of them had no serious mobility impairment. So I think that's the policy that should be used in California. And if we don't reform our placard policy, and we don't require off-street parking, then the question you answered, the question you asked, will occur all the time. Where am I going to park? If there's no curb spaces available, and a new building comes in with very few parking spaces, it'll cause a real problem. More people will be cruising for parking. So I think that we've done half of the reform that we need. One is to get rid of the parking requirements. The second half is to make sure that we charge effectively for on-street parking and set the price so that there are always 1 or 2 spaces available everywhere you go. And nobody can say there's no parking. Where can I park? You could just point on any block. Well, there's an empty space.
Right. Well, and as we've had students do in your seminar, and local news does every now and then, if you actually go out and see who is coming out of these vehicles with a placard, there's in many cases maybe even the exception for someone to actually have a clear, visible physical mobility issue. And you had that local news segment where they were standing in front of a gym, and you had people going into the gym with yoga mats or in running gear with these disabled parking placards.
Well, it seems like another victimless crime, and it's one that has a high penalty if you're ticketed, but they give very few tickets every year. It's very hard to enforce because you have to have a police officer waiting to see to talk to somebody anytime they get out of the car or come back to the car, and it's very expensive to do. And sometimes many of these placards, they're not really mobility impairments. One of the ones I liked best was a woman, a very sympathetic woman. She got out of her car, and the reporters with their cameras followed her into the gym where she gave yoga classes and very strenuous things. Things I couldn't do. and then when she came back to the car, it was a reporter, it wasn't police. They said, well, can I see do you have a parking placard? And she was quite contrite, but she said, oh, my doctor says I have a knee surgery and I have to be careful. And you felt sorry for her. And also they had pictures of her videos. She had a lot of videos of yoga in Hawaii, looking at this wonderful scenery and getting into weird poses and exercising. So I don't think they're evil. Some of them are evil people, I'm sure. But I think placard abuse funnels money to people who deserve it least, the people who you definitely, the kind of people who don't deserve a subsidy. Every year in my parking class, one of the options for an assignment is to look at parking meters in Westwood Village next to the UCLA campus for a couple of hours and film the whole 2 hours. And they showed all kinds of people jumping out of their cars with disabled placards and striding off. But it turned out of the meter revenue potential in Westwood Village, a third of it, over $1 million a year, goes to disabled placard use. Over $1 million a year in a little 15-block area. The money doesn't go to improving Westwood or even improving the city. It goes to give free parking to people who got their hands on a disabled placard. And with 55,000 vehicle trips to campus every day, and you have to pay $13 a day to park on campus. Why not park free in Westwood Village for as long as you want?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, hopefully we'll see some reform on that in the next few years. The Michigan is probably a good model, right, for California.
Well, that's right. And then when Illinois did it was after Rahm Emanuel came from, I guess, the Obama White House. He became mayor of Chicago, and he came in after Chicago had this disastrous policy of selling off the meter revenue for the next 75 years. It's like burning all the furniture on a cold night to stay warm on that night. So in the contract with Chicago parking meters, the city agreed that the Chicago parking meters would lose money from disabled placard use. So they agreed on what the city thought was the percentage of revenue that was missing because of placard use, and that was 6% of the revenue they collected. And they said anything above that, the city will pay Chicago parking meters because Chicago parking is not getting the money they paid for.
Right.
And it turned out that in the first 2 or 3 years, it was $20 million a year that the Chicago owed to Chicago parking meters for the placard use. And the Rahm Emanuel got incensed, and he got the Illinois legislature to adopt the Michigan policy of saying, yeah, there are 2 tiers, that somehow you could lose money. I think this is part of behavioral economics. Money you don't get doesn't seem awful, but the money you have to pay is terrible. So if you were losing $1 million a year in one little 15-block shopping center, has that caused the city or the state to do anything? No. But if you had to start paying $1 million a year, all hell would break loose. So I think that anyway, to get back to your original question, if we remove off-street parking requirements within a half-mile of transit, we'll have to be much more careful with avoiding disabled placard abuse and charging the right price for curb parking.
Right. Here. Well, yeah. So when I put the question out put the call out that we were going to be chatting, I think a lot of people were interested in learning more about you and how you got into this issue area. I think you insist that the Shoupista phenomenon is maybe people who are just fascinated by parking, but I think there is an interest in you as the messenger. Where'd you grow up? You're from Alexandria or Long Beach?
Well, I was born in Long Beach because my father was in the Navy and his ship was stationed there in 1938. But then we moved to Honolulu. And so my main claim to fame is that I was living in Honolulu when the Pearl Harbor was attacked. And so that's
I don't think that's your main claim to fame, but yeah.
It's certainly the earliest memory, and in comparison, the rest of my life has been very calm, comparatively calm. But then my father's ship was sunk near Australia, and we moved to Washington D.C. and lived in Alexandria for a long time then in 1950 we moved to Guam. And I lived there for a couple of years, and then went to Charleston, South Carolina, and then back to Alexandria, where I graduated from high school, and then so that's where I came from anyway.
And so what brought you back to California?
A job offer. When I finished my PhD, I came here to UCLA as a postdoc and liked it for 2 years, but then went into the job market. I taught at Michigan for 4 years in the economics department, and then got hired back at UCLA in urban planning because I got much more interested in land economics and urban economics. And it was Harvey Perloff at the School of Architecture and Urban Planning that who hired me. And he was a great leader in urban planning. He had previously been at the Resources for the Future, and he had a fellowship program that for a few years he gave very generous fellowships to any PhD students in economics who want to study urban issues. So he gave me one of those fellowships, and then he hired me. And then that's why I came back to UCLA in 1974.
Right. Well, you know, in a certain sense, it's always struck me as almost too perfect, right? You're a parking scholar and you're at UCLA. You know, when I had read some of your work before I came out here, and you talk about things like cruising for parking, and I don't think I fully understood that until I moved out to LA, where number one, parking is just totally top of mind, and yes, you will spend a lot of time cruising around looking for parking. So in a certain sense, it seems totally obvious that a UCLA scholar would think about parking. But as you've sort of said in other contexts, right, it's this sort of wonky, unsexy issue. When did you start to get into parking?
Well, I backed in. I think that the first publication that had the word parking in it, I checked, it was in 1970. But the first study I did on parking was in 1975. And it was on equity in transportation planning. And so the whole report was on equity. And I thought that employer-paid parking was very unfair because it gives a big subsidy to people who drive to work and nothing to anybody else.
And you don't commute to UCLA by car, right?
But I was then at UCLA. This was 1975.
And were you commuting by car, or were you bicycling, or what? Like, why care about the parking?
I was in 1975. I was bicycling. Yes, I still live in the same place. It's about 1.7 miles from home to office, and I was in a hurry, so I biked. Now I walk because I have plenty of time. But it wasn't the inefficiency that bothered me, or it was bothered me in what I was writing. It was the unfairness of giving a big subsidy to people who drive to work, which we were trying to discourage, and nothing to people who rode the bus or biked or skateboarded or anything else. And that seemed to be very unfair. And then, of course, it led me into realizing, of course, it's very inefficient. It's inefficient and unfair. I think most of our parking policies are both inefficient and unfair. So I made the proposal that if an employer offers free parking to commuters, they must offer the commuters the option to take the cash value if they didn't take the parking. So everybody's treated equally. You don't give any more money to one person than another, regardless of how they get to work. And it happened. I was spoiled then. I made a presentation. There was somebody from the assembly there, and a year later, there was a state law requiring parking cash out. And so I thought, well, gee, this is easy. And to some extent, it is, because it's such a simple idea. It's such a simple solution. And now Washington, D.C. has just copied the same legislation. And there's a bill in Congress, unsurprisingly by Congressman Earl Blumenauer, that would require everybody who offers free parking that is tax exempt must also offer the cash value. And I was thinking, or an equivalent tax exempt fringe benefit. And so I was trying to say, well, because free parking is still a tax exempt fringe benefit, which is working against everything the federal government says it's trying to do to reduce congestion and air pollution and carbon emissions. And there's a lot of evidence that I've done a number of studies showing that whenever you go from free parking to free parking with parking cash out, you get a big reduction in solo driving. On average, about 13 out of every 100 people shift from solo driving to another use. And it's so simple and it's so fair. So anyway, if I don't know if it'll get through in Congress, we've got a change in the House of Representatives, but it could work out because it seems so simple. And the argument I was trying to make to say, well, you shouldn't just say you could have free parking or cash. You could have free parking or another tax-exempt fringe benefit, one of which is a retirement account. So I think if people could turn their free parking into retirement income, it would be better for the whole country and for a long time. When I talked to a number of people, I said, parking cash out, they think that's a good idea. And if they're maybe your age or getting to be the age where I hope you're thinking, well, what's going to happen to me when I'm 75? That maybe if you thought you could convert a free parking space into higher retirement income, tax-free, it would all accumulate tax-free. It would be a much better idea than driving to work alone.
Mm-hmm. And you've had, I mean, even outside of parking, we were talking about this earlier, right? I think, of course, parking is going to be this issue that most people associate you with, but you've had a lot of other sort of, I think, little wonky technocratic policy ideas across planning, even outside of parking, right?
Well, I don't think they're little or wonky. I think they're wonderful.
Sure. Those are compliments. Wonky is especially a compliment.
Well, and they're also woke, I'll have to say. That one of them, I mean, there are two I can mention in the little time we have left. And both of them won prizes, one from the Journal of the American Planning Association and one from the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research, the two major journals in urban planning. And I thought, well, if I propose these two good ideas, and they got prizes, certainly the urban planners would pick it up. But one was what I call graduated density zoning. It's like zoning to encourage land assembly, and that we have LA has quite a large historic housing stock, not housing stock, but building stock, and a lot of our major avenues like Pico Boulevard amount to nothing more than shacks on valuable land. They're 50 feet wide, and they're all under different ownership. It's very hard to assemble several of these small lots of land to build in a higher use, because everybody wants to hold out for the higher value that the land assembly would create, or they just don't want to sell. So this graduated density zoning, which some cities have taken up, and give higher density for larger sites. And this would happen in one city. They had an area that had about 230 acres. And it was an old equestrian estate. It had very long, very narrow, but long, deep lots. And many of them didn't have any housing on them. And people, if we could assemble this land, we could build hundreds of houses. But when they tried to, I talked to the people who tried to assemble the land, and everybody said, "Oh, I'm saving it for my children, and I might want to use it later." But the mayor said, "Well, if you have more than 5 acres of land, we'll double the allowed density." And suddenly, everybody began talking to each other. Are you going to be part of a land assembly? And they began to be worried about being left out. See, if they were not part of a 5-acre lot, they wouldn't get the higher density. And within a year, all but, I think, 3 lots have been assembled, and they turned 17 houses into 230 houses, just because the city said, if you have a larger lot, you can have a higher density. I think Glendale says if you have over 90 feet wide, you could get twice the density as just a 50-foot wide lot. So I thought that was such a good idea. It's so much better than eminent domain, condemning the land and selling it to somebody to build it high density. It would leave it to a market transaction. All the city has to do is watch what happens. But it hasn't really picked up. The second thing I recommend, as I think, is even better idea called regulating land use and sale. Now we're regulating land use when you want to build something, and then we extract everything from you. We micromanage everything you do and see how many parking spaces you have to have. But when you sell your property, nothing happens. You just take your money and leave. But some cities, Pasadena is an example of it, whenever you sell your property, you have to have an inspection. And if there's a damaged sidewalk in front of your house, you have to have it fixed, or you have to set aside money to have it fixed later on. And they have, because the property transactions on average, about half of all properties are sold within every 10-year period. Mm. And some properties aren't sold for 30 or 40 years, but many of them are sold over and over again. But within 10 years, half of all properties, regardless what part of the country or what area of income or ethnicity or anything like that, about half of them are sold. So within 10 years, half of all sidewalks would be fixed. In LA, we have a terrible old sidewalks. The city back in the 70s said, we will pay for all sidewalks repairs. And then they never did anything. Mm. And so finally a lawsuit from the disabled people with representing people with disabilities said this is inaccessible. And the city said, well, this is not covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, yes, sidewalks have to be accessible to people with disabilities. And so now the city says it's going to spend $1 billion to fix its sidewalks, but it's going to take 30 years to do it. But in 10 years, half of them would be fixed at no cost to the city. Somehow it's an idea that hasn't spread the way I thought it would.
Hmm. Well, sometimes you put good ideas out there and then they're picked up at a later date, right? And it's kind of unpredictable how the politics line up on stuff like that.
My only gripe is that you published your book, Arbitrary Lies, and then within months everybody is doing what you said you told them to do. You're spoiled. I think you should be waiting until you're maybe in your 60s before people say, well, maybe he's right. No, it's wonderful the way your book has been picked up by so many people. It's partly the writing, mainly the writing. I think the ideas and the writing, they go together so well. And I hope I go along on your coattails. You complained about arbitrary lines. I've been complaining about arbitrary numbers. And together, I think the two of us, we'll save the cities.
We'll see. I think what I did was I got out in front of a parade that was already happening and tried to pretend like I was leading it, right? But no, it's sometimes these policies, the stars align, and I think certainly a lot of the work that the groundwork you've been doing on parking, I think, has really been teeing up a lot of what's happening right now. I wanted to also flag, I think also in your work there's a strong Georgiist strain. And it strikes me that there's a lot of renewed interest right now in Georgism. What's your relationship to that framework?
Well, I'm a Georgian. Yes, yeah. I'm a Georgiist. One of the first articles I wrote was on the site value taxation in Honolulu. And I think my policies are totally Georgiist. And as opposed to my early belief, I have a still belief that we ought to tax land rather than buildings, but it's been very hard politically to do. So what I have done is to say, well, here's the land that's surrounding all the privately owned land. The curb lane is this 8-foot wide frosting around every block. And I measured a lot of it in the Upper West Side. It's about 9%. The area of the curb lane is about 9% of the area inside the curb lane. So what have cities done? They've made it free. So I think a Georgiist would say we ought to charge market prices for it. It's land rent, and Henry George said land rent ought to pay for public services. It's the right source of revenue to pay for public services. So here I think cities have done the opposite of Henry George. They keep the curb parking free, and to compensate for that, they require off-street parking, which is like a tax on improvements. And what George wanted was to collect land rent for public use and remove taxes on off-street, on buildings. But we do just the opposite. We put a heavy burden on buildings to provide off-street parking requirements, and we fail to collect the curb parking revenue. So I think that parking benefit districts will implement Henry George's idea. It will take land rent and spend it on the adjacent areas. And how it's different from Henry George is that Henry George thought that the revenue would go into one big pot, like property taxes, and nobody would see any special benefit to themselves. But I think with charging for curb parking and spending revenue on the metered streets, the land rent, the beneficiaries know who they are. Mm-hmm. And the people who are going to pay don't know who they are. Say people driving into the east side from Queens, they have no say in what happens to the curb lane in the upper east side or the upper west side. So I think I have in a small way figured out a politically feasible way to implement Henry George's ideas on some of the most valuable land on earth. Say, around one block at the upper west side, it was about half an acre, and I got the most famous example of how much land is worth in Manhattan was about $150 million an acre. So if you divide that half of an acre by $150 million, it's about $500,000 per parking space. And it's just given away free and causing an immense amount of cruising for parking and air pollution and global warming gases that I think it'll have benefits that even Henry George hadn't thought about. Because it isn't just the revenues that's the benefit of charging the right for curb parking. It'll make the whole city more efficient, that we can allocate the land to the highest and best use, which may be package deliveries or Uber and Lyft stopping or shared cars. I think on a typical block where there may be 40 curb parking spaces on both sides, it would be better to have those parking spaces for shared cars. So everybody on the block could have access to a car instead of having privately owned cars which hog the space at the curb. We have shared cars that are used when people really need them. So I think that it's even has benefits that Henry George had not thought of. I mean, he was dead by the time the car arrived, and you wonder why I should be interested in Henry George. But he came in second for mayor of New York in an election. So I think that if I keep hammering away on this and talking on podcasts like yours, that maybe this idea will get through, that Henry, even people who've never heard of Henry George can see it's a good idea.
Right. You spend most of your professional career at UCLA. You're heavily inspired by Henry George, who of course was a Californian, or at least for most of his working career. Do you identify as a Californian? Do you see that as shaping your work or your worldview?
Oh, yes, definitely. Not just as a Californian, but a Southern Californian. I can't think of a better place on earth to live, especially because it's so improvable. I think if it weren't for our great climate, not nearly so many people will live and work here. But we've coasted on that. We've let our infrastructure decay. We've let our sidewalks crumble, and we've let the traffic congestion make life so difficult. I think if we had congestion pricing and the parking reforms, LA could be a far better city than it is now.
Mm-hmm. Other than parking reform, I mean, what needs to happen in Los Angeles? It does seem like to me Los Angeles is at a bit of an inflection point right now, where it seems like there's some recognition that a lot of things need to change in the city. If Donald Shoup is LA czar for a year, what are your priorities?
Well, I think just getting parking priced properly, the money spent properly, removing off-street parking will help a lot. And then the recommendations that you have is to reform zoning, is to allow more middle density housing close to or on the edge of or inside single family neighborhoods. I think that we could bring down we could reduce the scarcity of housing, and I suppose it would reduce the price as well. I think the neighborhood, I think a neighborhood with beautiful sidewalks and healthy street trees and well cared for asphalt on the streets that and well designed duplexes or fourplexes in single family neighborhoods would make the area a lot better. I think there are these planning reforms. I think our planning has been so counterproductive. We've been doing exactly the wrong thing. That what you were saying about zoning, we do exactly the wrong thing.
Right. Yeah. Well, of course, I agree with that. I mean, it does strike me, LA seems to be building quite a lot of transit and trying to and there's discussions of bus rapid transit along the major boulevards. It seems to me that it at least seems like we're generally moving in the right direction on at least some of those issues. And I think you're exactly right. I always say LA is the most fixable city in the world, right?
I think so. I think we're building transit at a snail's pace at enormous cost, and we still leave the roads congested. It won't reduce the congestion on the roads. It will help a relatively small number of people. But I think if we reform, at least for the underground rail, but if we reform curb parking so that we price parking properly, I'm sure it would be worth far more to the transit agency than to people storing unused cars. We can take lanes of traffic and convert it into the way the good express buses go. They're in the center of the road. And they have express buses. They're more like the South American versions of it. No, I don't think our current public transportation policies are good at all. We're spending so much money on building at a snail's pace, wildly expensive subways that won't reach the most of the city ever. When we could have much better bus rapid transit or express buses on freeways if we had congestion pricing and had express buses. They would go at 60 or 70 miles an hour. Say during COVID, when I made the proposal that why we should have congestion pricing is that during COVID, the travel time from Long Beach to UCLA was 29 minutes. But normally it's an hour and a half. And so at Long Beach does have some very good bus policies. They have express buses from Long Beach to UCLA 2 or 3 times every day. So if you wanted to take the bus to UCLA, there wouldn't be any stops anywhere. If you just get on the bus in Long Beach and get off at UCLA. And if it traveled at 60 miles an hour, it would take you about 29 minutes. So I think that reforming our use of the roads, both for curb parking and for driving, I think driving is way underpriced. That I think that LA would be more like Singapore. We could be more like Copenhagen or Amsterdam or Oslo.
I don't know that you would go to the neighborhood council and say we could be more like Singapore, but you could.
Well,
You could
no,
highlight
that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to appeal to people's self-interest. And I think with parking benefit districts, that you appeal to people's self-interest, saying that if we have this policy, your life will be much better. Your property will be worth more. Your business will have more customers. And you'll see the benefits right away. Say when Pasadena first started this, they had the first parking benefit district. It was like so many downtowns. They were wonderful buildings in terrible condition. Most of the buildings were empty above the ground floor, and many of them were empty on the ground floor. Some people thought it would never survive. It never survive. It wouldn't ever rebound to its. It was one of the best shopping areas in the country in the 1920s. But the city wanted to put in parking meters, and the merchants said, "No way! This is chasing away the few customers we have." And they argued for a couple of years, and finally, the city. Rick Cole was the mayor of the city. He said, "If we put in the parking meters, we'll spend all the money to fix your sidewalks and plant street trees and clean your alleys." And the merchant said, "Well, that's different. Why didn't you tell us that? Let's put the meters in right now. Why are you taking so long? Let's run the meters till midnight. Let's run them on Sunday." And the only thing that changed was where the meter money would go. So I think you just have to be more realistic rather than utopian. I think many of our students are more inclined to utopian solutions, and I'm looking for practical alternatives. And I think that I'm happy that I've seen some of these reforms right in front of my eyes, because I can remember an old Pasadena was a skid row. It was a commercial skid row, and now everybody goes there to walk around. Say 30,000 people on a weekend go to walk around in old Pasadena, and there's so many shops and stores and movie theaters. Just think of all the people it employs and how many families it sustains. Previously, very few people worked there, and not many families got any income from it. And now everybody has a good time there. So I think, yes, I think every day when I get up, and I bet you too, you think, well, I'm going to change the world. I realize that's not true, but I think if you have that in your mind, that it gets you going, you work on doing something. Yes, I think if you think it's going to improve the world, it gives you much more incentive to work as hard as you can and do the best what you can with what you have.
Sure. Well, in the home stretch here, I want to ask you a few maybe lightning round questions here, just short questions. First one is, what's your favorite city in the U.S.?
Well, aside from Los Angeles, you mean to live in?
However you want to interpret it.
Well, to visit, say, I'd much rather visit San Francisco than LA, and partly because of parking. Say for a concert hall downtown like Disney Hall, LA requires 50 times more parking spaces than San Francisco allows as the maximum. So here we have two different cities. One requires parking and the other one restricts it. Well, somebody's got to be wrong. I mean, if this were a real science, if planning were real science, like medicine, doctors would be worried. In LA, they give you, they let blood from you for a disease. In San Francisco, they give you a transfusion. That would never go in a real science. But in planning, we just slough it off. So I think San Francisco, of course, and San Diego, and Alexandria is wonderful. Washington, D.C. is terrific. And, of course, New York. Oh, they're all so many good places. And Seaside, you and I are going to go to Seaside. I've never been there, but I'm looking forward to where it's turned out to be a very expensive place to live, but it's only because it's well planned. It's the same. There's a huge area of the Gold Coast, but you have one really well planned city called Seaside. And the price, the land values of individual lots has gone through the roof because the planning is so good.
Well, and that's
So
a
I
market
guess
signal too that people want more neighborhoods like that, right? They want more communities like that.
exactly that. And you shouldn't criticize it as being exclusive and only for the rich, because it was started when there was just a field of dreams, and that the planning was so good that that it showed that it's expensive only because it's so rare.
Hmm.
It's not expensive to build. It's not expensive to plan. It's just that it's so different from what cities now plan, which is have free curb parking and all street parking requirements and very low density. You know, both of the things that you and I are focused on. It's the opposite of what most urban planning in the United States is, and it turns out people love it.
What's your favorite city abroad?
Abroad, well, Dublin is quite wonderful. My wife is from Northern Ireland, so we go to Dublin at times. And cities I've been to, well, Copenhagen is. I was too old to go to Sweden for the first time 10 years, but I thought Stockholm was a wonderful city in the summer. Uh,
Sure. What's your favorite film?
Film. Favorite film.
Well, you live in LA, right? So you have to have a favorite film, surely.
Well, I think if it's an LA film, I'd say Sunset Boulevard.
Okay.
Although I'm beginning to feel that I'm more like, if I were going to be in it, I'm more like Norman Desmond. That's right.
When someone's visiting LA, what's the first thing that you recommend that they do or see or eat?
Well, I like to show them UCLA because most people don't have any preconception of UCLA. They know what to expect from the University of Virginia or Princeton or Harvard, but they don't have any image of UCLA. And I think it's one of the best looking campuses in the country. And it's a wonderful place to eat as well. And where else? Of course, Venice. And I like to go to Two Harbors on Catalina. Two Harbors is a small village, not in Avalon, where everybody goes, but on all Catalina, they don't allow any cars to be imported. So it's a walking place. And the Two Harbors is it's a wonderful place where it's maybe about an hour and a half on a fast ferry, but you can look at the whole Southern California coast, and you're just on the terrace of a 100-year-old bungalow. And to think that there's a big city like this, that you could go a short way off the coast, and it's a totally different world. And you could look back and see the lights going from Malibu down to Orange County. Yes, I think Two Harbors is a place that I recommend everybody should go.
I still haven't been out to Catalina Island. I guess you got to take the ferry out of Long Beach, right?
Yes.
Right. Cool. Well, I'm sure we have more questions that'll come up on the Twitter when I share this. So I'll tag you, and you can engage as you see fit. I know you're a little bit of a minimalist with your Twitter presence. Oh, there was one extra one. Folks have asked about this. The origins of Shoup Dog. So you have this moniker that you go by. What's the origin story there?
Well, Snoop and I were both born in Long Beach, so that has to count for something. And it's obvious that it would appeal to the students. It was when I've been teaching an undergraduate class, so that's what I call myself, Shoup Dog. But when I listen to Snoop Dogg, I have a hard time making out what he's saying. But when you and he said to be really an outstanding citizen. He helps a lot of teenage clubs, and he's very charitable. He's a very upstanding citizen. But when you read the lyrics, they're not something you would use in a podcast. Let me put it that way.
Okay. No, certainly. Well, we'll play that maybe as an outro if we can get the editors on that.
Well, no, if you're going to play any music, you could do Salt and Pepper's Shoup song, and Cher has a song, Oop Shoup. So both of them, I think, are you can get them on the web, and they're very risque. Let's put it that way, because you ought to look up what SHOOP, what it really means in slang.
Well, we will leave listeners to do that on their own. Thanks so much for joining, and I hope you feel vindicated. You've been very humble since a lot of since the reforms have been underway, and a lot of cities have removed parking requirements, and this bill AB 2097. You've been humble through the whole thing, but I hope you appreciate the extent to which I think this is the outcome of your career of focusing on this issue. I don't think in a parallel universe where there's no Donald Shoup, I really doubt that all of this progress is being made, and I hope that other people will see you as a model who take up other small but highly important issues and embrace committing themselves to reform in those spaces.
Well, it's helped me a lot to have you arrive at UCLA just now. You're the best TA ever in a course. I think I'm more enthusiastic about keeping on teaching the course. I think that it's always tempting to call it quits. I mean, it's better to retire at the top of your form rather than waiting until they ask you to leave. But I think that you've done such a good job in helping me continue teaching that I think you've made a big difference in my life, and I'm really very glad that you're here at UCLA, and I look forward to your what you're doing next.
Well, we'll see. Right now, we're working on passing more reforms at the state level in California, but I can say, I mean, we have no trouble filling the seminar. I think a lot of students they know about you, or they've heard about you, or I think some of the engineering students think it's just going to be an easy class. But at the very least, a lot of folks come in super interested in parking, right? And I don't think most planning programs don't have a parking course, right?
No, I don't think any of them does, because nobody knows what to teach them. But I think, and you're right. It seemed like a very strange thing to do for a long time, to keep writing about parking. But that's an advantage of being an academic, especially one at UCLA. You could write about whatever you want to write about. And it was quite obvious that the other faculty thought it was trivial. But that
well, but you have a saying about being a bottom feeder, right? I mean,
well, that's right. I think that I was lucky. I think that's another humbling thing, is to realize how much of your good fortune is due to luck. Is that I think that most people couldn't see any benefit of studying parking. It was so obvious. Everybody's done it all their life. There's nothing there. Yes, I was a bottom feeder, but there was a lot of food at the bottom, and now other people are discovering it. There's a feeding frenzy. They're wonderful other young people who are doing terrific work, better than mine, like Mike Manville in our department, and Adam Millard Ball in our department, and people in other departments, Dan Chapman at Berkeley, and Rachel Weinberger in New York. I shouldn't be leaving people out. There are a lot of people, and then some professionals like Rick Cole. He's just coming back to Los Angeles to work in the city controller's office. And Bill Fulton. Bill Fulton is one of my heroes. He was a student in one of my economics class, and he was so enthusiastic about the textbook by that's right, that's his book.
Keep it handy. It's a great book.
And he said that this was a textbook, Micromotives and Macro Behavior by Thomas Schelling, a terrific book. and he said he read it out loud to his girlfriend in bed, and they later got married. So I think that the parking.
It's this dating advice, right?
Yes, parking can even lead to romance.
On that note, thanks for being the first guest of the podcast. This was great, and look forward to talking again soon.
Well, thanks for inviting me.